This has been an amazing energy, this symposium. It's been a lesson for me about getting out of my own way. You know, have you ever had those lessons? I'm learning so much with every step of the way. I'm really honored to have Jim Matlock here with us today. I've known him now for maybe 4 or 5 years at least. I've been following his Signs of Reincarnation Facebook page for years. It's based on his book, Signs of Reincarnation. And as you can tell, it's well marked, and I've read it 5 times. And I probably need to read it again because there's sections there that I thought, oh, I need to go into this deeper. And I also love his other book, which I have on my Kindle, I Saw the Light and Came Here. And that's a book he co-wrote with Erlander Haraldson. Wonderful, both of them. The way you write is really very engaging. You know, this is a deep subject, and where Ian Stevenson's work is very, very academic. It's not that Jim's isn't, but he does make it a little bit easier for the everyday person to be able to absorb all of the years of research that he has put into this. So I'm really, really thrilled to have him here. So what we thought we would do is start off, because I've read the book so many times, I wanted to share some of the questions that I had coming out of the book, and he'll answer them. And then I'm sure it's going to spark your own questions. If you can save your questions to the end, that would be really great. I think without any further ado, let's begin. For those of you who do not know Jim, I wanted to start with how you became interested in reincarnation.
How I became interested in reincarnation. At this point in my life, I'm an anthropologist. I'm trained in anthropology. My first choice of career was actually writing, creative writing. And I went through college wanting to be a writer. I majored in English, intending to do that. I found very quickly that I really couldn't make a living at it with the creative writing. I probably should have gone into journalism. I realize that now, but I tried to do it as creative writing. At any rate, I realized pretty quickly that I needed to try a different sort of writing, nonfiction writing. So I went to my local library. And at this point, this was in the early 1970s. So I need to back up and say that in college, I majored in English, but I double majored in psychology. And the psychology at the time, I was at Emory, was still behaviorism. And if any of you know what that means, it has a very materialistic idea of what consciousness means. And, you know, it's all, there really wasn't consciousness, right? It was all animals, humans included, just act in response to stimulus. Yeah. And I remember asking my mother about children, young children, if they had personalities when they were born. And she says, yes, they're all born with personalities and they just become stronger as they age. That answer sent me into what was becoming in the 1970s, the beginnings of the New Age sort of literature. Many of you probably remember that. I began reading in New Age sort of material. I was reading this in the background. And so when I went to my library looking for a new subject, I went to that section. I went to the New Age section in the library. And I was looking around for something, some topic to write about. And I came across the books on reincarnation. And I hadn't really thought about reincarnation before. But it intrigued me. I had noticed in my reading of literature the theme of rebirth and sometimes literal reincarnation coming up regularly. And at that point, there really wasn't, this was about 1980, there really wasn't anything general that had been written on the subject. So I thought, well, this is an opening for me. So I started reading. As I read, I gradually found Ian Stevenson's work, and some of you doubtless are familiar with his work. And that led me into the academic side of this. And once I found the academic side, so that's how I got into it.
Out of all of that, why were you drawn to reincarnation research?
Simply because I went through in the 70s, I went through Seth, for instance. I was really into, I was for Seth.
Did not get that.
Yeah, You know,
I learn
and-
something every day.
I was part of a set study group, and I was also reading a lot on hypnotic regression and so forth. But when I found Stevenson, I realized the difference between Seth and the regression things. What Stevenson did is, and you may have other questions on this, so I may be getting ahead of some of them. But what Stevenson did is actually investigate these past life memories, you know, in the field. He went out into the field and interviewed children and their families with past life memories. So it was no longer just a philosophical or a channeled sort of teaching. It was real research, and that's what hooked me.
Can you explain a little bit about Stevenson's methodology?
So Stevenson, as I said, I mean, he went into the field to investigate these cases because he was a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia. He had noticed in his reading was many accounts of children, young children, who claimed to remember previous lives. But these were basically anecdotal stories, right? They weren't, for the most part, very few of them were actually researched. They were journalists or others writing about the stories. But they were intriguing. So he decided that he needed to go into the field then and actually do the interviews to see, you know, what was going on here with them. When he did that, first field trip was in 1961 to India, what was then called Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. He discovered very quickly is that the children didn't simply have memories of the previous lives that could be verified. The people that they were talking about actually could be found, right? But that when you found the people that they were talking about, and you could actually, who were deceased, when you can compare the old life to the present life, you started to see correspondence of personality, carryovers of emotions, behaviors, sometimes even the physical things. So he realized very quickly that it wasn't just a memory phenomenon, and it wasn't just children having memories. They actually seemed to embody, right, re-embody something of the deceased.
And he started investigating cases when?
1961 is when he first went into the field.
So that's a lot of years. He really set the stage for reincarnation research, didn't he?
He did. He died in 2007. So he had the second half of his life. He was well established in his career, I should say, before he started this research. But for the second half of his career, second half of his life, he devoted it to the reincarnation research, mainly with children, some with adults. And the methodology that he established and the standards that he established in the reporting are ones that really did set the standard for the field.
If you've never been to Vision Perceptual Studies, it's really well worth a trip. They do an open house on the first Wednesday of the month. Hatar and I went there a few months ago, and it was really fascinating. And you get to meet the people involved in, and DOPS does more than reincarnation research. You want to tell a little bit about that? Because really your whole field is parapsychology.
Right. You know, my larger field, I focus on the reincarnation research, but that's within parapsychology, academic parapsychology. Well, let me first back up and say, so it's the Division of Perceptual Studies within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in the medical school at UVA. No, it's wonderful that they have the open house now. They have always had. Parapsychology the academic parapsychology is a broad field that includes both called spontaneous cases and laboratory research. One branch of it deals with psychic things like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition. That branch is particularly aligned with the laboratory. And then the other branch is more concerned with survival research. And that's where the reincarnation research that I do falls in.
And then don't forget near-death experience.
Okay, DOPS. DOPS does more than parapsychology. They always have. Near-death experiences are part of it, but they're also interested in consciousness. And this went on for some time, for some years. I mean, she would sleepwalk at night regularly, leave her bed and go get into bed with her parents. They put her back in her bed. She would do the same thing to me. She would wake up or not wake up, sleepwalk, getting back in bed. As she began to get older, she started complaining about her shirt, wanting the tags out of her shirt, complaining that they hurt her neck. The tags did. And none of this really made much of any sense to her parents. What was going on here? And then she was 3, I believe, when the first major clue happened. Her mother decided that she was going to take some formal portraits, formal photographs of the family. And she hired a photographer to come in, and they were taking photographs in the house and out in the yard. And in one of these photographs, Rylan is this. You see in the photograph, you see her just looking aghast. I mean, it's something. I mean, she's in the photograph, when you just see her, right? You don't see what she's looking at. It's something that's disturbing her. Her mother put that photograph, framed that photograph. She did many of them, and took that particular one to her office. Whenever Rylan visited her office over the next several weeks, she would point to that photograph and said, "Mommy, I was bigger in that photograph." What do you mean bigger in that photograph? You're 3, you're still 3, these things. But every time she saw the photograph, she would say the same thing: I was bigger. Well, it was quite a long while. I mean, it was another couple of years before the next thing came out. Her mother had just read her a good night story, turned off the light, was lying quietly in the dark. And she reminded her mother, "Do you remember that photograph where I was bigger?" And "What do you mean you were bigger?" And she said, "I died." And at that point, she said that she was in our yard. That's how she put it. I was in our yard. I was hit by lightning. It was at that point that her mother saw the first season of Ghost Inside My Child and thought, well, this might be something they're interested in. So she contacted the producers. And sure enough, they were interested in it. So they started following her. And fortunately for the research, they were following her when the next major development happened. So we have it in writing, in email. After some time, during this period, she continued to, memories began to bubble up in her mind. And she began to say things. She remembered the name Jennifer. She remembered at one point her brother asked her, where she thought she died. And she said, Canada, I think, or maybe Canada, or maybe Louisiana. She didn't say Canada at this point. Canada or Louisiana. She wasn't sure. Then when she was 6, she remembered a plane crash. And at this point, the mother had the clues that she needed. The girl had also asked about 1971. So the mother had the clues she needed: Canada, plane crash, 1971, Louisiana. So she went to the internet. No plane crashes in Canada in 1971. In Louisiana, there was a plane crash at the New Orleans International Airport, which turned out to be in Kenner, Louisiana, not Cannon, in 1982. Now, it was a Pan Am flight that took off from the airport there, hit a low altitude wind shear, and came down in a residential neighborhood, less than a mile from the end of the runway, took out houses on 3 streets, killed everybody on the plane, 6 people on the ground, one of whom was a girl named Jennifer, who was 11 at the time, born in 1971. So the pieces start to fit together. And all of this she's got in emails to the producer, which is wonderful from a research point of view, because then we have the written record here of the memories before they're verified. At any rate, I'm skipping over a lot here, but basically, this is where we were with the Ghost Inside My Child. So they took her back to Kenner, introduced her to her neighbor on camera. So that's where we were with the Ghost Inside My Child. When I interviewed her a few years after that, she was 10 when I interviewed her. she'd had a new memory come. And that is that she was in our carport, sitting on a swing. And a swing in a carport? Has anybody seen a swing in a carport? Most people say no, like me. And I said, are you sure it wasn't a porch swing or a yard swing? Because she started talking about, talking about the yard. But no, she was definite that it was a swing in a carport. And she was talking on the phone. Now, this is 1982, so you have to imagine one of these long, corded phones coming out from the garage, from the kitchen door into the carport. And she's sitting there talking on the telephone. And remember, when she first had this memory, she told her mother she was electrocuted in her yard with the lightning bolt. This time, she said she was electrocuted over the telephone line. She was sitting here on the telephone, watching the plane come towards her. In fact, the girl Jennifer was killed in her house, which was the first hit by this plane. As I say, it took out houses on 3 blocks. Hers was the first one hit. When I went there, so after interviewing her, I went to Kenner. This is what you do. You do one side and then you go to the other side. So I went to Kenner and interviewed her friends there. Also went back to the location of the house. And it turns out right in front of the house, there are power lines and telephone lines on the same poles, passing right in front of the house. And I learned in talking to people that at that point in 1981, telephone lines were uninsulated. Okay. So if they came in contact with the power lines, it would have been possible for a surge to come up. So she could well have been electrocuted. All right. Now, I went and got her autopsy report. Friends that I interviewed had no idea what had happened to her. This was a huge, you can just imagine, the scale of it. It took 3 days for her body to be found. They were working on some of these other houses. 3 days before her body was found. And the way the news is, because I read a lot of all the news stories, basically, I looked at. The news stories had moved on by the 3rd day. So there was no news story about where her body was found on the 3rd day. Her friends did not know where her body was found. A lot of them, they told me, one of them told me, well, it was found in a swimming pool. I mean, it was somewhere else. It was supposed to have been moved. Now, the autopsy report said that it was found on the floor of the carpet. Furthermore, that there was no signs of smoke inhalation in the lungs or of discoloration of the blood. And what that means is that she was dead before the plane hit her, or before the plane came, okay? So in order for the plane to hit the house, it had to cut through that power line and the telephone, right? So if indeed that telephone line had struck the power line and there had been a surge, she would have been killed probably instantly before the plane hit her. So it all fits.
Isn't this fascinating?
It's fascinating. Nobody knew this, except for her. And this is the question then, how could she know this? And this is the sort of thing that we do.
Wonderful that you followed up on that case and dug up that information.
Yeah.
I switched between having a researcher's mentality and a therapist mentality. And so with this, when I listen to this story, I've got my Sherlock Holmes hat on and just so fascinated with all of these bits of information. And if you think that was fascinating, this afternoon when we talk about the case of Rabia Alawar, you're going to hear even more fascinating details. So thank you for sharing that story. Probably most of you have not heard it, and all of the details that go with it are just so amazing.
Yeah, really.
I love that. And then will you, I know it's not as detailed as that case, but will you share a little bit about your daughter's story?
My daughter, when she was 3, and it's not, as you say, it's not nearly as elaborate as this. Told us that she remembered having come to us. We were driving, or I was driving, and we stopped at a light, And there was a motorcycle ahead of us. And she said, Daddy, do you like to ride on motos? And she's bilingual, her mother is Peruvian. And so she used the Spanish word motocicleta, moto. And I said, I do not like to ride motorcycles. I said, no, honey, they scare me. And she said, very earnestly, she said, you have to hold on real tight. I said, honey, when have you ridden on a motorcycle? Was it in Lima? Because her mother would take her back to Lima every year. I was working, so I couldn't go back for Christmas. And she would take her back there every year. So I wasn't with her continuously, right? Was it in Lima? And she said, no, it was a long time ago, before I came to you and Mommy. That's how she put it. And then later, she said to us, she said she had seen us. And that she said, you and Mommy were looking for a baby. So I came to you. That's how she put it. In a lot of these cases, and about 20% actually, so it's a good number of them, the children do have, and I'll talk about this later, do have memories of the period between their death and their rebirth. And this was one of those intermission sort of memories, where she claimed to have seen us, and during that intermission period between the death and rebirth, she had, seen us and elected to come to us. She said a few other things when she was 3.
Wasn't there a pink
A
house?
pink farm, yeah, I want to get to that. And this was the really significant thing about it. She also, in this first time of talking about it, she said that, and it really impressed her, that she was at she talked about it very fondly. She remembered being in a pink house that later it emerged was part of the pink farm. Now, her mother and I had been driving up I-81, and we had passed a pink farm, and it had really, really, really made an impression on us. The perimeter fence was pink. All of the buildings were painted pink. The whole thing was pink. We talked about this. We were living in DC at the time. We talked about this after we got back to Washington. It made such an impression on us. At any rate, so here she is talking about having been on a pink farm, right? Was it the farm that we saw? I never had time to go back to it, unfortunately, at the time. When I've driven that way more recently, the farm is no longer pink. It's now gray. In fact, it's no longer even a farm. It's now a KOA campground. For a while there, so this happened. We saw the pink farm maybe it was less than a year before she was conceived, right? So it's possible that the person at the farm died and became her daughter. Now, Christina is also quite an artist. She has been very talented with her art from very, very early on. We got her an easel as soon as she could stand up, because she recognized that she enjoyed it so much. And she would stand for hours at her easel. The woman in the pink farm, and I think this ties into why it was pink, it seems to have been an artist. I mean, it's one of Christina's memories of being an artist. This is an example then of the carrying over of talents, of personality into the new life. Even though it's not a case that we can solve, that's the term we use when we identify the previous person as Ryland, it's still an interesting case. It still has significant things to tell us.
You're reading my mind as a segue into the next question. So the book is titled Signs of Reincarnation. Out of all this massive, the volumes that Jim has read, researched, and has wonderful recall on it, much better than my personal recall. Out of all of that, you have come up with certain signs of reincarnation. So share those with us.
This goes back to Stevenson too. I mean, this is what we see in these cases, what he identified and what we still see in the research. There's certain basic, signs, let's call them. One is the past life memories that children have. Another is the behaviors. And along with that, we can put personality, and then there can be physical signs too. And we'll get to physical signs after this Q&A, there'll be questions, and then I'll have a more formal talk when I'll run through my theory, and in doing that, I'll explain how I understand the physical signs to manifest in these cases. Because that's a puzzlement, right? I mean, the body dies, how can you have physical carryovers? So I'll explain that, or at least how I understand. So those are the three major classes of signs, and we see over and over and over again in these cases. But we see other things too. For instance, these intermission memories, that is memories of the period between lives. And there can be dreams associated with that. Many women, while they're pregnant, shortly before they become pregnant, or men who are, are the women who are close to them will have dreams to the children to be reincarnated. So that's another. So those are sort of really the basic signs. I'll be talking more about this later, but those are the basic ones.
I'm the reincarnation regressionist, and you're the researcher. And I know you have some real strong opinions about regression for reincarnation research. So what do you feel are the pros and cons for using past life regression therapy for researching past lives?
Well, it's sort of it's a complex question, frankly. So what I'm concerned with, you're right. I mean, it's not the regression. I'm concerned with spontaneous cases. I'm concerned with these memories of the children who have these memories and who then embody these previous, the previous personalities in their personality, rather than regressions under hypnosis. Now, when I first got into this, you may recall I mentioned I first read a lot on the regressions. So I've read on both areas, and I see the difference. The reason I shifted immediately as soon as I started reading Stevenson into the spontaneous cases is because they're much richer in the phenomena. It's not just memories anymore. You can actually identify the previous people much easier, and when you do that, you see the behavioral similarities. It's not just the emotions and things coming through during regression, hypnotic sessions. It's actually, you can see, how this was transferred into the child. My feeling at this point is that regressions can be very, very helpful in therapy. And as a therapist, you know that they can be. From a research point of view, they have very little value, though, because it's very difficult with the regressions to get enough information to identify the previous paper. Sometimes that can be done, but most of the time it cannot be done. And so you're left with just a story that you have to sort of accept. When with therapy, it doesn't really matter whether that story is true or not, factually. If it's psychologically true, it can still help you. It can still help the therapist. From a research point of view, it's not really very helpful. And this is something Stevenson found very early on, because he tried using regression to bring out, additional memories, and it didn't help. And there have been a number of studies now that have looked at regression experiences versus the spontaneous, and they've shown consistently that from an evidential point of view, as opposed to a therapeutic point of view, that the regressions are just not really very useful. So that's my position.
Mm-hmm. And however, there are a couple of cases that you brought up in your book. One was Bruce Whittier. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, there are a few cases like this that anything that stills the mind, meditation can allow the memories to come up. We have memories coming up in the states before we hypnagogic and hypopompic states, we going in or coming out of sleep. In a variety of different altered states, sometimes drug states, these memories will come up. So anything that sort of gets the brain out of the way, and that can include hypnosis, can allow these memories to come up. The reason that I think we see the difference between in the regressions and the spontaneous cases, and this again is something that I'll get into more later, because it's part of my theory, is that with the regressions, you're trying to induce the memories, right? I see all memory as being in the subconscious, not stored in the brain, but in the subconscious, in the conscious mind, in the subconscious. When they come up spontaneously, they come up with the permission, as it were, of the subconscious. The subconscious is ready to let the stuff go. When you go into hypnosis, you're deliberately trying to circumvent that, right? You're deliberately trying to get by the blocks to conscious awareness, and your subconscious doesn't like that. And it reacts by putting up distortions, and this is what we see. So, I mean, that's how I understand it.
And how about the case of Robert Snow, who remembered Carol Beckwith? That was one of the more spectacular cases that you mentioned.
Right, and that's one of the best known ones too, of as a veridical of a a factually true is a regression case. What is interesting about that to me is that it was Captain Snow discovered who his regression memories were about, not because he remembered the name of the person. It turned out the name he recalled under hypnosis and the name he recalled for his wife were wrong. He discovered who he was because he remembered painting. And he just happened, I don't think he just happened, I think he was psychically arranged on his part, but he came across the paintings that he saw himself painting. That is how he learned who he was. So if he had gone, and he did try to go with the names that he remembered under hypnosis, he didn't get anywhere. Had he not found those paintings, he would not have been able to solve his case. And this sort of makes my point. The subconscious in the regression is putting up these blocks. It's putting up these distortions. It doesn't want you to know. But good things can come up.
Mm-hmm.
Good things can come up, though. We have to keep that in mind too.
Yeah, and just like your follow-up with the Ryland case offered more information, I think there's a process that's happening, and we found this in Rabia's case too. More things came up the more we sat and talked about all of these things. I want to finish up my end of the questions with having you tell us about your course of Signs of Reincarnation course at 15 weeks.
Yeah, it's 15 weeks.
And
yeah, as you see, I like this title, Signs of Reincarnation. It's the title of my book. It's the title of my Facebook group. If any of you are on Facebook, come join us. Where the subtitle of my book is Exploring Beliefs, Cases, and Theory. The subtitle of the Facebook group is Experiences and Research, and we invite people to share their experiences, and I and other admins respond then to the experiences from the research point of view, trying to put them in context and explain. Because for many of these experiences, they're not as developed. They're not these developed kind of memories that we can research, right? But we can look at them in terms of the patterns, right? We can say this fits what we see in the research or this doesn't. So that's what we do in the Facebook group. And then there's my course. If any of you are interested in this, it's a graduate level course. I have to say that always. So that people aren't surprised by what it is. You have taken it. You have taken it. Yeah.
And it's tough and it's fascinating. I just loved it.
So
Yeah.
can anyone take it, or only if you've graduated with the
No,
bachelor's?
anybody can take it, but you just be prepared. I mean,
Okay.
I'll let Carol probably, she's taken it. Should be. I'll say something and I'll allow her to say something about it.
You've got to do a lot of reading, and then when you meet for the classes, what I loved about that, we had just beautiful open discussion about, the assignments for reading, and then that led into many rabbit holes, and it's just a great way to take a deep dive into the research, and I highly recommend it.
When are you offering it again?
January, beginning in January. It was designed.
Online.
It's online. It's a semester-long course, and this is the book, the textbook for it, and we go systematically through the textbook. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And
Like I said, it's the best course that I have found, and I hope it gets more recognition, really, because it covers so in depth this topic, and you share so much wisdom. Like I said, you can ask questions spontaneously. It's like, wow, where did he pull that out of? But it's just fascinating to be connected with someone who's so well-rounded and well researched. So, all right.
it's originally designed. Let me just say this about the course. Since COVID, we've added a Zoom component. So we now have weekly Zoom meetings in addition to the writing component, right? And so that's what you're referring to,
Yeah.
is the Zoom interaction, which gives people a chance to actually talk, they can actually ask me questions, but also talk, among yourselves more, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of interaction.
Yeah, I loved how you opened the floor for us to talk with one another. And, anytime you are able to ask questions openly, that's just amazing. And that's what we're going to get to next. If anyone has any questions, come up to the podium here so Martha has a question.
I actually have two questions. How do you sign up for your course? With the book, the graduate level book. How do you sign up for your course? And the other question is, I'm curious to know if, so I'm a therapist, and with my clients, I implement EMDR and neurofeedback, and I encourage them to engage in bilateral activity, that like yoga, somatic yoga, really anything bilateral, involving brain balance and brain gym, things like that. I'm curious to know if bilaterally stimulating the brain and balancing the brain assists in the recovery of past life memory. If you think that there's a significant impact that might have.
Yeah, very good question, actually. Yeah. So in terms of the best way to learn about the course is to get a link to it. Either go to my website or to email me.
Okay.
But if Carol can put up the links to it, then
Great.
that will solve that
Cool.
problem. If your question, yes, I think so. I mean, like I said, anything that helps move back, diminish the brain's domination over consciousness helps these memories come up. These sort of techniques are designed to do exactly that, right? And so yes, things like that, just like meditation also can allow these memories to bubble to the surface if they want. You have many questions.
I do, and I'm trying to find the best one.
It's fun when I
You
print
may
it this
ask
way.
more
It's
than
when I
I don't
print
know.
it. Oh,
I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned the phrase solving a case. Can you talk a little about Ian Stevenson's protocol and standards where you're required to solve a case?
Okay,
And also the ongoing research has to be done. Ongoing research
Right.
in vision perceptual studies.
okay, you mean what they're doing now in general?
Yeah, you've got thousands of cases, but how do they actually determine the case is real? The standards.
Right. Okay. I mean, the simple answer to that is that you try to determine, who the previous person was, but how do you go about doing that? Well, I gave one example of that with Ryland, the story of Ryland. You have to have enough details in the memories, the child's memories. Typically, so adults we're finding have these memories too, but typically the research has been done with children. So I'll often say child instead of just saying subject, right? Which is another way of saying it. So the child has got to say enough detailed things to allow for the memories to be investigated. The previous person that the memories are about to be identified. That's what, in the brief term, that's what solving a case means. It means simply identifying the previous person who is the referent of the memories. It's often not so simple because you need to be sure that the person identified and only the person identified fits those memories. You start with the memories, you find what you can, but you want to look for the more specific type of memories. And we some of these cases have 30, 40 memories, 50, 60, sometimes more occasionally. And we can divide those between the types of things that could fit many people and the types of things that are so specific they can only fit one person. The more of these specific memories you have, the more they help narrow down to one specific person. And so in order to claim a case solved, we have to be satisfied that we have identified one person who fits the memories to the exclusion of everyone else. When we've done that, we then get the identification then becomes reinforced because then we can compare the two lives. And as I said, we start seeing the similarities in behaviors and personality and all these things. So did that help answer that part of the question?
Yeah, and also, how many do they reject? How many have they solved?
How many have they
No,
solved and how many have they
The
rejected?
yeah, the question is, how many have they rejected and how many have they solved? Because DOPS has 2,500 plus cases.
The last figure that was given from DOPS was about, in 2013, it's been published from DOPS, was about 2,500 cases that have been researched. 1,700 of those solved. That's just at DOPS. My cases are not at DOPS. Those of many other researchers are not at DOPS. So we have considerably more than 1,700 cases that are solved. But that gives you a figure for what we're talking about here. Obviously, a lot more people than that have lived and died. But at the same time, it's not an insignificant number. It's enough for us to see patterns. And I'll be talking more about the patterns that we see in this data set later. Another way of asking is how many of those have been published? Because the majority of the DOPS things have not been published. They're simply in their files. Between 400 and 500 have been published. Cases have been published.
Verified cases?
Between 400 and 500 solved and unsolved cases have been published. Most of those are solved because for the most part, researchers haven't bothered with the unsolved cases, describing the unsolved cases. Stevenson did describe a few of them simply because he wanted to show that there were unsolved cases and how similar they are to the solved cases. By and large, as you can imagine, it takes a lot of time and effort and money to research one of these cases. And then it takes more time to write it up and go through all the process of getting it published in a journal. And so we, the research community, have to be somewhat selective about which cases we decide to take on. And those tend to be the solved cases, the more impressive ones, right? And increasingly ones that contribute something new. 450 or so solved cases have been published, and they investigated, and that's not counting the uninvestigated ones that are more anecdotal. You'll find a lot of those out on the web and some in more popular books that have not been fully investigated, but are very similar sorts of cases. There's no real reason to be skeptical of them, but on the other hand, they haven't been investigated, and so they're not of the same.
This
Now,
afternoon, we're going to go into one of these cases that has a lot of evidence, so.
we will go into one of Stevenson's cases, a follow-up study that Carol and Katara Toom and I have done of a follow-up of one of Stevenson's cases. Rabia Eliwar is now 60. Stevenson last saw him when he was 14, and he wrote about his case as a child, and we were talking about that follow-up. Now, the second part of your question had to do with what DOPS is doing now. Is that correct?
Yes.
So Jim Tucker, who has been the director there in recent years, is retiring at the end of this year. They have brought on several new people who are doing very exciting things. They're moving, though, maybe away from the case investigation, which is one of the things that Tucker did, to more general sorts of analyses using their large database, right? Looking at patterns, looking at process things as opposed to proof-oriented things. Not that we're trying to prove reincarnation necessarily, but proof-oriented in the sense of looking for facts as opposed to looking for patterns and processes. So increasingly, they're moving into the process thing. They've submitted a major grant that will begin looking at genetic factors. They have a new lab director who's interested in things like taking people into the lab, having past life memories, and seeing, what that looks like.
Can you explain a little bit about that lab? Because it's very fascinating.
They do have a lab there, and they have a new lab director. It's a small lab, and they are part of UVA. They're part of the med school, and so they can get the equipment they need. And if they can't do the things that they need in that lab, then they have the resources of the university available to them. But anyway, one of the things that they're interested in is looking at the brain correlates of past life remembering, and then they'll be able to compare to that to, people imagining things, the normal memory, and this sort of stuff. So there's some really very exciting things going on. Final thing I need to say on this is that we do have a new director coming. We don't know who that is. depending on who the new director is, this may go in a very different direction. We just don't know.
News at 11.
News at 11.
Yeah. We have a question from someone online, John Ray Barges. Have you documented a person resolving a current health issue when they discover the past life cause of illness or disability? Can you think of a case? I can't remember one off the top
There-
of my head.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because this is something that's claimed a lot in regressions. That that people regress, to the supposed previous life, something that's recalled, and then this helps resolve the ailments. With the spontaneous cases, particularly when the children go back to the place that they recall having lived, very often this does bring about a resolution to their memories. A lot of the anxiety they felt goes away. So at that level, yes.
More of an
Now,
emotional level.
at an emotional level, yes. At a physical level, do I know of cases where remembering the past life, or rather identifying the previous person, has allowed those symptoms to be resolved? I'm not sure. There are cases where physical symptoms do continue, but I think I'd have to go and look at this. I think they sort of continue. Now, maybe they do lessen. Can't think offhand of one where they've been completely resolved. But here again, this is the issue that comes up with the regressions. And one of the things that the skeptics point out about it, there have been very few follow-ups on these claims. There are a lot of claims, and some of you may be therapists and have experience and can speak to this, but there are a lot of claims in print about issues being resolved, but without any follow-ups. So you don't know whether this is a temporary resolution or it's a long-term resolution. You just don't know.
That's a good point.
And so this is one of the skeptical, things that's said about the regression therapy.
Follow-up to that question is, have you ever encountered anyone who suffered from an illness or situation in a past life and became a therapist or doctor in the current life with a desire to come up with a cure for that past life illness or situation?
I would say no to that. And the answer is partly because we're only beginning to get follow-up studies of these children. Like the one we'll be talking about with Rabia El-Awar it's the first one that's really done in a case study way. There have been follow-up studies like this that have been done in Lebanon and Sri Lanka and Brazil and now the United States by DOPS, but they have not looked at individual cases. They've looked at groups of people, and they haven't focused on that issue so much, changes in that way, and so I can't think of one, but that doesn't mean that one doesn't exist. I mean, we just don't have the data for it.
Maybe putting the question out there will spark some answers to that question. Could multiple people have a very strong past life recall of being the same person?
No, there's no evidence of that at all. I mean, this is something that many people like to be true because it helps solve the problem that you have with regressions with several people remembering the same previous life. But no, when we look at the spontaneous cases, we do not see this. The closest we see, and I'll mention this because, and I'll probably be coming back to this because it's a really interesting issue. There are cases where in some cultures, where Native American cultures particularly, and we also see in some areas too, where multiple children are identified as having been the reincarnation of the same person. However, when we look at these cases, when we study them, the multiple reincarnates that are claimed to be reincarnates do not all have memories of the person. And this is the critical thing, memory. The question was about memory. And no, there are these identifications, but the identifications are based on these dreams, based on behaviors, based on things other than maybe physical signs, things other than memories, right? And so this leaves open the question of social construction, right? Is it simply are they simply imagining this? Yeah, no, in the spontaneous cases, we do not have any examples of multiple people recalling the same life.
Right, and I was trying to look in your book, the book that Antonia Mills wrote, where she did a lot of case studies in the indigenous people in Canada and North America and some in Africa. And that cultural belief came up, but I think you said that they weren't able to verify that they were
Well,
memory.
she's the principal person who's investigated these cases in British Columbia among the native peoples there. What she found is that there are these claims, but only one of the children in the set had memories. The others did not have memories.
Well, I think this is a wonderful way to start the morning. I hope it's planted lots of seeds of question. As you will see when we, at the end of the day, how labor intensive, tedious, following every little clue on a case is when we talk about Rabia's case. And it takes a lot of patience, a lot of time, but it helps us have a broader understanding of why we're here, I believe. And so thank you again, Jim,
Yeah.
for sharing your book, your wisdom. And in our next segment, we're going to take a little break. And then in our next segment, Jim is going to talk about, after doing all of these studies, you can't help but come up with your own theories. And so he's going to go in depth into his theories about what you call processual. Do I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, the processual soul theory, and I'll explain what I mean by that.